You see that plaque over by the old co-op silos? The one talking about the hero of Oakhaven? Honestly, every time I drive past it, I just have to shake my head. Before that night in the summer of '84, nobody in this town looked at me twice. I was just Jack, the scrawny kid who never washed the grease out from under his fingernails. I was a dropout, a quiet guy who spent more time talking to carburetors than to people. I was just a dirt-poor farmhand who they only called when the good mechanics were too expensive. Nobody took me seriously. But that night, when the horizon turned orange and the smoke made it impossible to breathe, they didn't have a choice. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about knowing my tractor and knowing that if I didn't push that machine to its absolute breaking point, we were all going to burn. This is how it really happened. I was born in '62, right when things in rural America were starting to get complicated. Growing up in Oakhaven wasn't like the idyllic farm life you see on TV. We were poor. Not just struggling poor, but wearing the same jeans for a week and hoping the soles of my boots don't fall off during gym class. Poor. My family's farm was small, dry, and dying. My dad worked himself to the bone. That's just what men did back then. But the harder he worked, the more the land seemed to resist him. I remember him coming home with dirt caked into his wrinkles, staring at bills on the kitchen table like they were some foreign language. He was a good man, but he was tired. We all were. The '80s hit us like a sledgehammer. People in the cities were talking about big business and new tech. But down here, the banks were foreclosing on farms left and right. Every time you went to town, there was another "for sale" sign, or another family packing up and moving east, looking for factory work. It felt like the heart of the country was just withering up. I wasn't good at school. The books made my eyes go blurry, and the classrooms felt like cages. But put a wrench in my hand, and everything clicked. I understood gears. I understood timing. I understood how one piston connected to another, and how fuel and air made something heavy and dead spring to life. By the time I was 12, I was the designated mechanic for our ancient, leaky International harvester. By 15, I was fixing neighbors' threshers because they couldn't afford a trip to the John Deere dealership. People would laugh, seeing this skinny kid head first in an engine bay, but they stopped laughing when I got the machine roaring again. My dad used to say, "Jack, people are complicated. They lie to you. They leave you. But a machine is honest. You treat it right. You learn its language, and it'll work for you as long as its parts hold together." I lived by that. The clatter and roar of a diesel engine became my language. It was the only thing I felt I had control over. When I turned 20, our farm was done. We were just hanging on, barely growing enough to feed ourselves. Dad's back had given out, so it was all on me. I had to get a real job, and in Oakhaven, that meant trying to get on with Miller's Industrial Ag. Miller's was the biggest outfit around. They owned the biggest fields, the newest equipment, and they paid the best. They were the ones you called when your own crops had failed, hoping to rent their crews. I remember walking into the foreman's trailer. The foreman was a big guy named Silas, with arms like hams and a face that looked like it was carved from granite. He was busy shouting into a radio. When he saw me, he just gave a snort. "We're full, son. Get lost," he said, not even looking up. "I'm not looking for a handout," I said, trying to make my voice sound deeper. "I heard one of your tractors, the big 4850, when it was pulling in from the west section this morning." Silas finally looked up. "So? A lot of people hear our tractors." "It's missing," I said plainly. "Your driver thinks he just needs a fuel filter. He's wrong. It's got a bad injector pump. If you keep running it like that, it's going to seize, and that's a $20,000 engine block ruined." Silas stared at me. I could see him trying to decide if I was crazy or just cocky. He was quiet for a long, heavy moment. He pulled a keyring from his belt and threw it across the desk. "It's in Bay 4. If you can fix it before sunset without using any new parts, you're hired. If you can't, I'm kicking your ass off this property personally." I grabbed the keys. I didn't even say thank you. I went to Bay 4, grabbed the largest wrench I could find, and got to work. By 4 p.m., I had stripped that pump down, found the burr on the internal plunger that was jamming it, polished it smooth, and reassembled the whole thing. When I cranked the key, that 4850 didn't just start. It purred. Silas was standing there when I climbed down, my hands black with grease. He didn't smile. He just nodded and said, "The night shift starts at 6 p.m. Don't be late. And get a shower. You smell like a scrapyard." I had the job, but I had no idea what was coming. Working for Miller's wasn't a dream job. It was a grind. The 80s were hitting the big farms hard too, so they pushed the equipment and the men until something snapped. I was assigned to the night shift, which meant I lived in a world of yellow floodlights and moths hitting the windshield. My main rig was a John Deere 4850. Back in '84, that was the king of the field. It had a turbocharged engine that sounded like a thunderstorm when you opened the throttle. It had a sound guard cab, which was supposed to keep the dust out. But in Nebraska, the dust finds a way. It gets in your teeth, your hair, and your soul. My job was simple but exhausting. Pull a massive disc harrow across the north sections. These fields were miles long. You drop the plow, set the throttle, and stare into the dark for 12 hours. The only thing you could see was the sliver of dirt caught in your headlights and the glowing green dials on the dash. The other drivers didn't like me much. They were older guys, mostly bitter because they'd lost their own farms and were now forced to work for Miller. They called me Grease Monkey, or the Kid. "Hey Jack," one guy, Pete, said to me one night while we were fueling up. "You spend more time polishing that tractor than you do sleeping. It's just metal, kid. It don't love you back." I just shrugged. I didn't tell him that the vibration of the floorboards was the only thing that kept my head straight. I knew every bolt on that 4850. I knew that if the engine pitched up a half octave, a belt was slipping. I knew if the steering felt mushy, the hydraulic fluid was getting too hot. I wasn't just driving it, I was part of it. That summer was the hottest I could remember. The ground was so dry it was cracking open like a jigsaw puzzle. We hadn't seen a drop of rain in 6 weeks. The corn was stunted and brown, and the wheat fields, miles and miles of dry, golden stalks, were basically giant piles of kindling waiting for a spark. Everyone was on edge. The local sheriff had banned all outdoor fires. People were even scared to flick a cigarette out a truck window. One spark, and the whole county would go up. One Tuesday night, the heat was still sitting at 90 degrees, even at midnight. I was out in the North 40, a massive stretch of land that bordered the edge of Oak Haven. The town was just a cluster of dim lights about 3 miles away. My dad was back there, probably asleep in his chair, and the rest of the town, the grocery store, the school, the old folks' home, was tucked away in the valley. I was exhausted. My eyes were stinging, and the diesel fumes were heavy in the air. Around 2 a.m., I stopped at the edge of the field to check the hitch. I climbed down from the cab, the hot wind whipping my hair. I looked toward the west, toward the old abandoned railroad tracks that ran along the edge of the Miller property. That's when I saw it. It wasn't a big fire. Not yet. It was just a small, flickering orange glow near the tracks. Maybe a passing train had thrown a spark, or maybe some local kids had been out there being stupid. It didn't matter how it started. What mattered was that the wind was picking up, and it was blowing that flame straight toward a 5-mile stretch of unharvested, bone-dry wheat. And behind that wheat, the town of Oak Haven. I scrambled for the radio in the cab. Silas, do you copy? This is Jack. We got a fire on the west line. It's moving fast." Static. Nothing but static. The hills always messed with the signal out there. I tried again, screaming into the handset, but nobody answered. I looked at the fire. In the 3 minutes I'd been watching, it had tripled in size. It was eating the dry grass and heading for the wheat. If it hit the wheat, it would become a firestorm. It would move faster than a man could run, and by the time the volunteer fire department got their old trucks moving, the town would be surrounded. I looked at my 4850. I had a choice. I could drive back to the main office and get help, but that would take 20 minutes. By then, it would be too late. Or I could do something crazy. I didn't have water. I didn't have a shovel. All I had was a 15-foot-wide disc harrow and a tractor with 190 horsepower. In the farming world, there's a thing called a fire break. You plow the dirt ahead of the fire so the flames have nothing left to burn. But you have to be fast, and you have to get dangerously close. I didn't think about the bank, or my paycheck, or Silas. I just thought about my dad sleeping in that town. I slammed the tractor into gear, shoved the throttle all the way forward, and steered the nose of that John Deere straight toward the smoke. The first thing I noticed wasn't the light. It was the smell. It wasn't like a campfire. It was a thick, choking stench of dry wheat and rubber. The wind was howling now, sucking the air toward the flames, making the fire grow like it was breathing. I slammed the throttle wide open. The 4850 let out a roar that I felt in my teeth. I wasn't just driving, I was aiming. I had to get ahead of the fire line, right between the burning railroad tracks and the edge of the Miller wheat field. If the fire jumped into those thousands of acres of wheat, it would be a literal ocean of flame, moving at 40 miles an hour. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I dropped the disc harrow. The sound was deafening. Imagine 15 feet of heavy steel blades slamming into sun-baked, rock-hard Nebraska dirt. The tractor groaned. The RPMs dropped. For a second, I thought the engine was going to stall out, but I shifted down, gritted my teeth, and felt the tires bite. I started carving a line. A black line. It's the only thing a fire can't cross. Dead, turned-over dirt. Inside the cab, the temperature started climbing. The sound guard glass was supposed to be tough, but as I got closer to the edge of the flames, I could feel the heat radiating through the windows. It felt like standing too close to an oven door. I looked out my side window. The fire was only 20 yards away now. It was a wall of orange, 20 feet high, twisting and snapping in the wind. The smoke was so thick I couldn't see the front of my own hood anymore. I was driving by memory, following the fence line I'd plowed 100 times before. "Come on, girl," I whispered, patting the dashboard. "Don't you quit on me now, just a little more." Suddenly, the tractor bucked. A huge rock, or maybe an old buried stump, caught the disc. The whole rig shuddered, and I heard a sickening snap of metal. One of the hydraulic lines to the harrow had burst. Hot oil sprayed everywhere. If that oil hit the exhaust manifold, the tractor would become a torch, and I'd be trapped inside a glass box of fire. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I shifted into a lower gear, keeping the pressure up, dragging the broken harrow through the dirt by sheer horsepower. The engine was screaming. The temperature needle was buried in the red, and the warning lights on my dash were blinking like a Christmas tree. I looked toward the town. I could see the water tower in the distance, silhouetted by the glow of the fire. Nobody was coming. No sirens, no lights. They were all asleep, oblivious to the fact that a mile-wide fire was sprinting toward their backyards. The smoke started seeping into the cab through the vents. My eyes were watering so bad I could barely see the dials. I pulled my shirt up over my nose, breathing in the scent of my own sweat and stale diesel. The fire was right on top of me now. The paint on the side of the tractor started to blister and peel. I could hear the wheat stalks popping like firecrackers as they turned to ash. I reached the end of the first pass. I had carved a 15-foot strip of dirt, but the fire was jumping. A gust of wind caught a clump of burning grass and tossed it right over my head, landing in the dry wheat behind me. "No!" I yelled, slamming the steering wheel. I spun the big machine around, the tires kicking up massive clods of earth. I had to double the width of the line. I had to go back into the thick of it. That's when the engine started to cough. When a big diesel engine starts to cough, it's a sound that'll make a mechanic's heart stop. It's not like a car sputtering out. It's a deep, rhythmic choking, like a giant trying to breathe through a wet rag. The air was so thick with ash and smoke that the 4850's air filters were choking. I looked at the gauge. The intake was restricted. The engine was starving for oxygen. "Don't you do it," I growled, my voice raspy from the smoke. "Don't you dare quit!" The fire had jumped my first line. It was a small patch, maybe 20 feet wide, but in this wind, 20 feet becomes an acre in 60 seconds. I swung the tractor around, the heavy disc harrow groaning as it tore through the dirt again. I was driving parallel to the flames now. The heat was so intense I had to lean away from the left side window. I could see the paint bubbling, actual bubbles forming on the green hood of the tractor. The smell of burning rubber from the tires was starting to compete with the smell of the wheat. Then, it happened. A loud bang from underneath the floorboards. The tractor jerked violently to the right. One of the main hydraulic hoses, the one I'd been worried about, finally gave up under the heat and pressure. The steering went stiff. It was like trying to turn a mountain with a toothpick. I slammed my boots against the brakes, locking the inside wheel to force the tractor to pivot. It was an old farmer's trick, using the brakes to steer when the wheel won't turn. It worked, but it put an incredible strain on the transmission. I could hear the gears grinding, a high-pitched whine that sounded like a wounded animal. I was right in the path of the fire now. The smoke was black, thick and oily. I couldn't see the water tower anymore. I couldn't see the town. I was in a world of orange and black. I had to make a choice. If I stayed in the cab and the engine died, I'd be baked alive. If I jumped out and ran, I might make it to the road, but the fire would definitely hit the town. I thought about my dad. I thought about the old ladies at the grocery store who used to give me peppermint candies when I was a kid. I thought about Silas, who gave me a chance when nobody else would. I didn't jump. I grabbed the manual throttle and shoved it past the safety stop. I needed every ounce of torque. The engine gave a massive black sooted belch from the exhaust stack and surged forward. I began the dead run. I dropped the harrow deeper into the earth, clawing up the wet, dark soil from underneath the parched surface. I was burying the fuel before the fire could reach it. The heat was melting the plastic trim inside the cab. My hands were burning just from holding the steering wheel. I was screaming at the top of my lungs, not out of fear, but just to keep myself from passing out. "Get some, come on!" I yelled at the wall of fire. I made it to the end of the field. I turned. I made another pass, then another. I was a ghost in a green machine, carving a massive 50-foot wide scar across the face of the earth. Then, the world went silent. The engine didn't just stop. It seized. The heat had warped the pistons. The 4850 gave one final, shuddering gasp and died. The silence was terrifying. The only sound left was the roar of the wind and the crackle of the fire just 30 feet away. I sat there in the dark, the cab lights flickering out, watching the orange glow move toward my new, wide dirt line. I watched, holding my breath, as the flames reached the edge of the black dirt I'd turned up. The fire hesitated. It licked at the dirt. It searched for a stray straw, a piece of grass, anything to climb over, but there was nothing. I had dug deep. The fire hit the wall of dirt, and it began to die down.